Mark Epstein is an award-winning psychiatrist in private practice in New York City. He is the author of several books and articles about the interface of Buddhism and psychotherapy. He is currently a clinical assistant professor in the postdoctoral program at New York University. Tonight, in recognition of the paperback release, he'll be discussing his book, The Trauma of Everyday Life, which uses Buddhist teachings to explore the transformational potential of trauma in the mind's development.
It sounds funny to be called an award-winning psychiatrist, but for those of you who don't know me, I am a psychiatrist, which means I went to medical school. I'm a therapist in New York City, but I had the unusual circumstance of being exposed to Buddhism and involved with Buddhism before going to medical school and before I really knew very much about anything. So my interest in Buddhism really was like a prism through which I did my medical training and have become a psychiatrist, a therapist, and a writer. And a lot of my writing has been in an effort to try to figure out what I do and don't understand. I thought that if I could put it down on paper, often using my own experience as my primary case study, that I would be able to find out what the Buddhist influence really has been on my own life and work. So it's in that spirit that I wrote this book, which is about trauma and is also about everyday life. It's about Buddhism and it's about psychotherapy. I didn't really begin thinking I was going to write about trauma. I began wanting to write about the fact that the Buddha's mother died when he was 5 days old, and that no one had ever done anything with that fact. And so I started out thinking that I would write a kind of psychobiography in the spirit of Erik Erikson of the Buddha. And then it turned into a kind of deeper examination of the potential of trauma and the place of trauma in both Buddhist thought and in Western psychoanalytically influenced thought. I was interested in what we call attachment in the world of psychotherapy, and also in what the Buddhists call detachment and the relationship between attachment and detachment. And I found that the Buddha's loss of his mother was kind of a stand-in for the difficulties that can come with early attachment, early infant-parent attachment. That kind of lurking underneath the story of the Buddha was perhaps some trouble that he had to work out in his own leaving of his wife and his own son, that he had to work out in his own journey towards awakening. And I tried to weave my ideas about that through this book. So I'll read you some little excerpts and give you some of the flavor of the book, and then we'll have time for some questions. Okay? The most important thing we can do about suffering is to acknowledge it. Simply acknowledging it, while seeming like a minor adjustment, is actually huge. A friend of mine told me how, when his mother died when he was 5 years old, his father told him one morning that she was gone and would not be coming back, and then never talked about her again. While extreme, this response is emblematic of our natural instincts. We would like to pretend that everything is okay, that death does not touch us, that we are not possessed by primitive agonies whose origins are murky at best, that we are somehow immune from the unbearable embeddedness of existence. Many of my patients, conditioned by Western psychology, feel that once they have some understanding of where their feelings come from, they should be finished with them. But we are not built that way. Primitive feelings continue to be stirred up throughout adult life. Understanding them does not turn them off. They are our history, our emotional memories, part of the people we have become. Another patient of mine, whose mother killed herself when my patient was 4 years old, became unusually anxious when she was engaged to be married recently. She knew why, of course. What if her new husband were to disappear as precipitously as her mother did? but knowing why was not enough. My patient's betrothal gave her another chance to face emotions that had been too overwhelming to face at the time of her mother's death. In taking possession of those traumatic feelings, she was also being freed from the grip of them. Rather than enacting her panic and fleeing from her new husband, she could settle into her present-day relationship with a newfound compassion for the bereft girl still soldiering on inside herself. Like a mad child long lost her old mother, my patient came to see that the maternal energy she needed was actually present within. Changing her attitude, changing the way she related to her panicky feelings, gave her access to that all-important energy and allowed her to go forward in her life. So that phrase, like a mad child long lost her old mother, I've used that phrase in a number of different ways in the book. It actually comes from an 18th century Mongolian Buddhist poem that my friend Robert Thurman translated. It was an enlightenment poem of a Mongolian monk who began the poem saying, like a mad child long lost his old mother, never could find her, but she was with him always. And it's a poem about his discovery of what he calls mother voidness or mother emptiness. It always resonated with me, I think, because even though my mother is still alive and so on, there was something in me that always felt like a mad child long lost his old mother. And that idea of what Winnicott called primitive agonies that come from before language sets in early childhood, but that lurk in the body, that come up in intimate relationships, that surprise us in meditation or in therapy, is something that I try to talk about in the book. A friend of mine who spent years in India with a great teacher from the ancient forest tradition tells the following story. Years after his beloved teacher had died, he was back in India, staying at the home of his guru's most devoted Indian disciple. "I must show you something," the disciple said to my friend one day. "This is what he left for me." My friend was excited, of course. Any trace of his teacher was nectar to him. He watched as the elderly man opened the creaking doors of an ancient wooden wardrobe and took something from the back of the bottom shelf. It was wrapped in an old, dirty cloth. "Do you see?" he asked my friend. "No. See what?" The disciple unwrapped the object, revealing an old, beat-up aluminum pot, the kind of ordinary pot one often sees in every Indian kitchen. Looking deeply into my friend's eyes, he told him, "He left this for me when he went away. Do you see? Do you see?" "No, Dada," he replied, I don't see." According to my friend, Dada looked at him even more intensely, this time with a mad glint in his eyes. "You don't have to shine," he said. "You don't have to shine." He rewrapped the pot and put it back on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe. My friend had received the most important teaching, one that had its origins in the Buddha's revolutionary approach. He did not have to transform himself in the way he imagined. He just had to learn to be kind to himself. If he could hold himself with the care Dada showed while clutching the old pot, it would be enough. His ordinary self, wrapped in all of its primitive agony, was precious too. The word that the Buddha used to describe the sense of unsatisfactoriness or anguish that he said underlay even pleasurable experiences in life, the word he used was dukkha. And that word dukkha, which we usually translate as suffering, actually means hard to face. So I think the actual meaning I like because it relates to the discussion of trauma. That traumatic things, either big trauma, when horrible things happen out of the blue, or even smaller trauma like what we now call relational trauma, when there's malattunement between parent and child, and these feelings of primitive agony get stored somewhere in the brain or body. Those feelings, the natural reaction to trauma of whatever sort is to turn away from it. We call it dissociation, and to kind of banish the difficult feelings somewhere, in the unconscious or in the night, in the dreams, in the body, to turn away from those feelings. So a split is created that we call dissociation. And I think this story of the old pot and not having to shine, speaks to the kind of reclamation of the dissociated feelings that is necessary both from a Buddhist perspective and from a psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic perspective. So it's one of the places where I see those worlds coming together. There's one sutra called the Splinter of Rock discourse, which describes this in very physical terms. When I first came upon it, I liked the title right away. What was the Buddha going to say about a splinter of rock? In it, the Buddha is surrounded by 700 devas. Devas are godlike beings who often found it edifying to hang around the Buddha. He was surrounded by 700 devas who praise him for his fortitude in enduring the pain of the splinter of rock lodged in his foot. Not complaining at all, the sutra reads, the Buddha endured the pain with mindfulness and comprehension. I was struck by the image of the Buddha nursing a painful wound. Even though he was a Buddha, he was still subject to pain. While I knew it was not a psychological wound, I could not help imagining that it might have been. I read the concluding stanza avidly, curious about what advice he might give to his admiring audience of otherworldly beings. In this world, said the Buddha, he who is conceited lacks self-control. He who abandons conceit, who has a tranquil mind and who has wisdom, is free from all existence. A forest dweller leading a lonely life, if he practices mindfulness, can cross over the plains of existence where death prevails to the other shore. His well-chosen words certainly seem to hold out hope for those who suffered emotional as well as physical distress. Someone leading a lonely life could cross over from the plains of existence where death prevails to another shore. There, lying on his robe on the ground, the Buddha was talking quite personally. I thought again of the Buddha's early loss of his mother. Maybe the splinter of rock was not just a splinter of rock. Maybe it was a stand-in for all of the pain we can do nothing about. Whether or not this was actually true, I began to consider it as another example of the place where Buddhism and psychotherapy overlapped. Developmental trauma leaves us with feelings we cannot control, feelings that rise in the night, feelings that color our minds without our really knowing where they come from. The rush to leave those feelings behind, to pretend they are not there, only leaves us more in their sway. The Buddha was modeling a different approach in this little discourse. He was lying there, showing the gods what it meant to be human. Over the years, I've gone on a number of silent Buddhist meditation retreats, some in Western Massachusetts, not that far from here. And they're silent, and you're not supposed to read or write or anything, but I often sneak a little notebook in just in case I hear something extraordinary or in case I have a very important thought. And I don't have that much written. It's a very little notebook. But over the years, every 5 years, 10 years or something, I'll look at the notebook in case when I'm stuck in my writing or I need something. But what I found is that over 30 years, probably more than 30 years now, I keep writing the same thing down over and over again. Because every time I hear it, it's like I'm hearing it for the first time. So it seems so revolutionary, you know. And the main thing that I've written down is it's always some variation on, it's not what you're experiencing that matters, it's how you relate to it. And that applies, you know, in the depth of those meditation retreats where, you know, your mind is really talking to you. But it applies in everyday life also. You know, it's not what you're experiencing that really matters, it's how you relate to it. That's what you have control over. More control over. You might not have that much control over that either, but it's possible to learn. I was reminded of these connections recently by another patient, whom I'll call Alexa, an inspiring 35-year-old writer who told me how upset she had been with herself for uncharacteristically losing her temper with her 3-year-old son one busy weekday morning. Her story was not atypical for parents of toddlers. Her beloved child was beginning to wear her out. She was trying to get him dressed and fed and out of the house, and he was frustrating her at every turn, not wanting to put on his shoes, taking off pieces of clothing when she turned her back, asking her to play a favorite game with him, and altogether refusing to cooperate with her pleas. Having made it through his terrible 2s, she was not yet prepared for how trying his 3s could be. Exasperated, Alexa had unloaded on him. "You think the world revolves around you, and it doesn't," she cried impatiently. There was a brief pause in which he gazed at her wide-eyed. "It moves, Mama?" he replied. His earnest cry cut short her irritation, of course, and rekindled her delight in him. She still remembers the guilt she felt, though. Why would she want to say such a thing? How could she shatter his safe worldview in an instant out of anger? His words functioned a little bit like a Zen master's response, his innocent question stopping her in her tracks. How does he even know that revolve means move, she remembers asking herself. Alexa had successfully created a world for her son of which he was the center. Her exasperated comment only affirmed how productive she had been at fostering this illusion. Her son had what therapists call a healthy attachment to his mother. He was able to take her support entirely for granted. She had given him the attunement and responsiveness necessary to ward off most developmental trauma. She had wanted him to feel like he was the center of the world, and she had succeeded, and she was right to have done so. As today's therapists conceive of it, her first major task as a mother was mostly done. The second task, of gradually easing her child into disillusionment, of failing him just enough that he could begin to know her as a separate person and relate to her empathically, could only be undertaken if and when the first mission was accomplished successfully. It was my guess that the unexpected friction between Alexa and her son heralded the beginning of a disillusioning process that would likely proceed as smoothly as the first several years had gone. Her son's unexpected reply, however, tapped into another kind of truth. The world, despite our mother's best attempts to shield us, does move, incessantly, unpredictably, and without regard for our feelings. As human beings raised, if we are lucky, to be the centers of our own little worlds, we are continually taken aback by this reality, even if we have been successfully cared for by our good enough parents. The Buddha, whose meditations resurrect the holding environment and auxiliary ego function of the good enough mother, also served as parent in this important way. He too did not shrink from disillusioning people who still harbored the impression that the world revolved around them. There's a story that I often repeat that says much the same thing. When I was much younger and traveling in Thailand with some of my Buddhist teachers, we went to visit the teacher of one of my teachers, Jack Kornfield's teacher. a Thai forest monk named Ajahn Chah. And he gave us this little teaching, told us this little story, held up the drinking glass that he always used and showed it to us. And he said, "Do you see this glass? I really love this glass. It holds the water admirably. When I hit it, it makes a nice sound. When the light shines on it, it reflects it beautifully. But for me," he said, "the glass is already broken. When my elbow knocks it off the shelf or the wind blows and it falls and shatters, I just say, of course. But because I know that the glass is already broken," he said, "for me, every minute with it is precious." And it was that last part, that every minute with it is precious, that I always remembered. Because the Buddhist thing of like, okay, everything changes and everything dies, you know, you can put you into a place of too much detachment, you know, too withdrawn. But the every minute with it is precious, you know, is really about everyday life. And I think that's the actual message, that when we're not afraid, you know, I sometimes say that if we're not suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, we're suffering from pre-traumatic stress disorder, because it's lurking, you know. And if we're not afraid, then we can live as if every moment is really precious. I'll read you just a couple more, because we'll have some questions. On my most recent silent retreat at the forest refuge, I had an experience of the ground being pulled out from under me, and I could sense how unnerving this disillusion could be. It happened at breakfast toward the end of my week there. I had been craving toast for several days. The food had been remarkably good, but I had gotten it in my head that what was lacking was fresh-baked bread. It didn't seem like such a big thing to wish for. The vegetarian meals just needed this one little touch to feel complete. On this morning, 6 days into my stay, the bread finally appeared. Granted, it was gluten-free and made from chickpea flour, but it still looked good. I cut myself a slice, toasted and buttered it, took a little bit of apricot jam, made myself a cup of tea, and settled silently into my seat to relish it all. I was very mindful and lifted the toast to my lips to take a bite. It was delicious. I chewed and tasted and swallowed and noticed, the way I had been taught, how I wanted the next bite before I had completely finished the first. When the sweetness faded and the remnants of toast turned to cardboard in my mouth, I was ready for more. I waited, though, remembering the instructions for mindful eating. Finish each mouthful completely before taking the next bite. I have only a vague recollection of what happened next. I believe my mind wandered to the laundry I had to do the next morning. There wasn't that much to think about anymore, but that didn't seem to be stopping me. Would I do one load or two? Could I put them both in at the same time? My wife would be happy if I came home with all my clothes washed. The next thing I remembered was that my toast was gone. Who ate my toast? My mind cried as I stared at my empty plate. And for a brief second, before the humor of the situation could take hold, the whole thing became a metaphor for my entire life. Ready to relish it, and it was already gone. I was staring into a big, empty, devouring hole where my toast and my life used to be. Who ate my toast? I repeated once again as I swiped my finger at the few crumbs left on my plate. That's what happens on those retreats. When my father was dying from his brain tumor, I realized that I had never had a conversation with him about anything spiritual. He was a scientist, and while he was proud of my success as a writer, he never expressed any real interest in the kinds of things I was thinking about. I was reluctant to engage him in too much discussion, knowing that he was not interested, and that seemed fine with him. When it became clear that his malignant brain tumor was inoperable, however, and that his days were severely numbered, I began to wonder if I shouldn't try to talk to him about what I had learned from Buddhism. This was a challenge, not because of his tumor, which was deep in the right side of his brain and had not affected his cognitive abilities, but because I needed to find a way of talking to him in plain language without recourse to concepts he did not believe in. I called him on the phone from my office, not knowing that several days later he would slip into a coma from which he would never emerge, an unintentional infection from a brain biopsy several weeks previously, taking its iatrogenic toll. As I mentioned at the beginning of this book, my father, although a physician, successfully avoided the subject of his own mortality for much of his life. This is not an uncommon strategy for dealing with death, and there are many sutras in the Buddhist canon that show the Buddha confronting it with whatever persuasiveness he can muster. My father had worked until he was 84, until he got lost one day driving the same 10-minute route home from work that he had taken for the past 40 years. The tumor was already inside his brain. As he was not used to facing a challenge he could not overcome with his intelligence, there was an air of resignation hovering over this, our last conversation. You know the feeling of yourself deep inside that hasn't really changed since you were a boy, I began. The way you felt the same to yourself as a young man, in middle age, and even now. My father voiced his assent. I was trying to summon the place of intrinsic relational knowing for him. It is there in our own subjectivity, although it is difficult to describe. We know ourselves from the inside. We have an intuitive feel for ourselves that is outside thought. And we relate to other people, indeed to the world, from this place. Most of the time in our active and harried lives we gloss right over it, but it is there in the background and we return to it in our private, unscripted moments, when listening to music, taking a walk, or going to sleep, for example. My father, as best as I could gather, seemed to understand what I was getting at. It's kind of transparent, that feeling, I went on. You know what it is, but it's hard to put your finger on it. You can just relax your mind into that space, though. The body comes apart, but you can rest in who you have always been. Death is like taking off a tight shoe, I wanted to tell him, but I wasn't sure he would believe me if I went that far in the conversation. Yet I thought, with his scientist mind, he might just sense the possibility of investigating what I was suggesting. If the Buddha was to be believed, there was a place of lucidity from which even dying could be observed. Okay, darling, I'll try, he replied. I wondered for an instant if he was being patronizing, but I decided he was not. He often called me darling, and I was glad for it in the end. Thanks. The question is about my, my reference to the translation of the word dukkha, the word the Buddha used for suffering or unsatisfactoriness, which is the way we usually translate it. The actual meaning, if you take the word apart, is hard to face. I believe it was from Professor Robert Thurman, who told me that dukkha, the do is difficult or hard, and the ka is face. The opposite word is sukha, which you might have, if you're in the Sanskrit, Buddhist, South Asian world, you'll hear the word sukha, which means sweet to face or easy to face. It's, means the sukha is used for pleasure, and dukkha is used for unpleasure. Easy to face or hard to face. Is it at all close to anxiety is the question. Yes. Anguish is the word that Stephen Batchelor has used to translate it. Angst would be good too. It's trying to get at an underlying sense that not everyone feels or admits to, but that many people feel and have a hard time talking about. Even when life is good, there's a sense of if it could be a little bit better, if only I knew how. The Buddha said that, as I think I read that part, that the most important thing to do about dukkha is to acknowledge it. That's in his first noble truth. He says, he doesn't even say life is suffering, which is how it's come down to us. He just says one word, and the one word was dukkha. So hard to face, kind of with an exclamation point. And then he says, then he gives the cause. He presents the Four Noble Truths as if he's a physician. He describes the illness, gives the cause, says that there's a cure, and then describes the medicine. Those are the Four Noble Truths. The question is about my use of the words, the mother void, and the concept of the mother void. And she was saying she was sitting with a patient, I think a patient the other day, who was saying that the patient, had one of those dead mothers. And she's wondering whether that's along the lines of what I'm talking about. Well, yes and no. In the poem, I was like a mad child, long lost, my old mother, never could find her, though she was with me always. The title of that poem being The Discovery of Mother Voidness. The mother that's being discovered there is the exact opposite of the dead mother. That mother is the alive mother. She's being talked about as emptiness, which is a Buddhist concept. The Sanskrit word is shunyata. But emptiness, the meaning of that word comes from the emptiness of a pregnant womb. The root of the word goes to a syllable that means like seed. So it's not void like we think void, dead, empty. It's void like pregnant womb, full, containing everything. So the Buddhist idea of emptiness is saying that there's no such thing as an isolated individual or an isolated object, that because everything is in its essence empty, that means that nothing can exist as a thing in its own right. Everything has to be a part of everything else. So then the idea comes of emptiness or voidness as the mother, which actually contains everything. So that poem is the Mongolian Lama in his small identity. I was like a mad child, long lost his old mother, talking about the feeling that I could relate to, like I'm just a little person and I'm, what's wrong with me, and but that swelling fullness of the pregnant womb, which is also in our, there's some relationship of that to our awareness, which is also capable of being infinite. When the monk discovers that sense of emptiness within himself, he's reconnected with the mother who has always been there. That's the idea. I'll be happy to talk about that. She's asking if I would talk about my experience going to med school after having first discovered Buddhism. Was there a dissonance in that experience? Well, as I mentioned in the reading, I came from a medical family. My father was first a professor of medicine at Yale, and then he was professor of medicine here at Harvard. So there was a lot of pressure on me to go to medical school, which I was like not going to have anything to do with. So I, very resolutely had nothing to do with it until I got into the Buddhist thing. And then I had the idea somehow that I wanted to be a therapist, that being a therapist meant mostly sitting and doing nothing, and I was good at that. That it would be work that wasn't really work, So that really motivated me. And after I became obsessed with Buddhism, it all of a sudden occurred to me, I can go to medical school, I was always good at all of that stuff. So I took all the pre-med courses after I graduated from college. I took them all in a year, and then took a year off and traveled all around India with, went to that monastery where the glass was broken, and then came back and started medical school. And in my first several months of medical school, I thought I had made a horrible mistake, and I tried to drop out. I went to the dean, I went to the admissions people at Simmons social work school and said, I've made a terrible mistake, I just want to be a therapist, I don't want to, it was like, seemed like swallowing all this information and regurgitating it made me really unhappy. But everyone convinced me that I was being impulsive and I should stick it out and so on. And that eventually, it would give me a lot of freedom. So I listened to them, and it got a little bit easier. I didn't really feel, in some way I felt dissonant, in other ways I didn't. When I did my psychiatry training, which was 4 years worth at New York Hospital, before I moved to New York, I was living here in Cambridge, and I had a friend here who was a Sufi psychiatrist who took me aside before I went, and I was going to train at this place where a psychoanalyst named Otto Kernberg was running the program, and he had a very ferocious reputation. And my friend, the Sufi psychiatrist, took me aside and he said, you should keep your Buddhist thing to yourself, because if Otto Kernberg hears about it, he's going to eat you alive. So I very dutifully kept it to myself all through my training. I talked about everything but that. And then I had Kernberg as a supervisor, one-on-one supervisor for a year. And I really liked him. And we talked all about emptiness, in fact, because the hospital specialized in borderline patients who complain of this feeling of emptiness. And I wanted to know whether their emptiness was the same as Buddhist emptiness or different. So I had lots of conversations about that. But I still didn't tell Otto that I was too much interested in the Buddhist thing. Then they offered me a job at the hospital as assistant unit chief, which I took for a year. And I decided, okay, they offered me a job, I can start to talk about it finally. And then all the psychiatrists on the staff, except for one person, all the psychiatrists on the staff were so interested. And there was one guy who I had thought was a straight psychiatrist, who was already leading group therapy for the Zen Center that was then in the Bronx, that Bernie Glassman was running. He was leading group therapy. People were much more interested than I had given them credit for. And that's when I started doing my writing. I was like, oh, okay, it's already infiltrating, So that's a long-winded answer that is maybe answering your question. It helped me. The Buddhist thing helped me when in training in the hospital, when I was an intern and doing medicine and surgery and so on. It helped me relate to the patients as people. I was very attuned to that's something I can do, that I know there's something in Buddhism that I know this fits together, and maybe that was already me wanting to be a psychiatrist, or maybe that was the Buddhist influence, I'm not sure which. But being in medical school is like being in the army. As long as you do your job and report accurately to your superior, and don't try to do what you're not qualified for, everyone leaves you alone. They're happy with you. So, and as long as you write your notes, So I would write my notes first and do my reports, and then I just hang out with the patients, and that I actually sort of liked. The questions about recovering from trauma. Do I think that for someone who practices Buddhism, studies and practices Buddhism, whatever that means, is the Buddhist approach enough by itself to help someone recover from trauma? Or is there something else that's necessary? And if so, what is that other thing? No, I don't think the Buddhist thing is enough. In Cambodia, for instance, where they have a Buddhist culture, after the whole Pol Pot thing, if you want to see trauma in an entire population, you go to Cambodia, and it was Prozac that helped people there. They had the Buddhist understanding, but there was just like way too much pain that people were dissociated from and plagued by, and so on. And there, then they had one psychiatrist or two psychiatrists in the whole country, So I'm not saying that Prozac is the answer by itself either, but but it was very helpful in a whole traumatized population. I think we need to recover from trauma, if there is such a thing as recovery from trauma, which is another whole issue. I think we're all programmed in a certain way to want and to think that we should be able to recover from trauma. Recover meaning get back to who we were before we were traumatized. And I'm not sure that that's right. But I've definitely worked with people who have lost their children and who've become ill and, terrible, the kinds of traumas that don't befall everyone but do befall some people. And there's movement over time, long periods of time. My experience is that stuff doesn't go away but becomes more familiar. And in its familiarity, it's not as oppressive. And then people begin to experience who they are now, which is different from who they were before. And I think the Buddhist, the mindfulness practices, which are very popular now in the world of psychotherapy, they've been pulled away from the Buddhist context, and they're being given to people as psychotherapeutic techniques. I think they can be very helpful in teaching people that it's possible to, in a way, desensitize themselves to intense emotions. Or familiarize themselves with aspects of their experience that they thought were unbearable. Those techniques are very helpful in kind of tiptoeing in and then being able to move away from, so gradually deal with those kinds of feelings. But I think a therapeutic relationship with a real person where things can be talked about, that's as important or maybe more important than just learning these cognitive and behavioral techniques. When the relationship is good, when the relationship is good, it's really special, and I think that's like almost a miracle in our society that it still exists. Two people sitting together for no reason, other than to try to figure out what's going on between them in the room. It's very unusual, and good things can happen from it. The question is, I have references to Freud in my books, but very few, if any, references to another seminal figure in the history of psychoanalysis who was interested in Buddhism, and that's Carl Jung. Could I comment on that? That has everything to do with the various teachers that I found over the years and with the limitations in my own knowledge and experience. So I always thought I would learn hypnosis, and I never found a good teacher of hypnosis. I always thought I would be a Jungian and that I would study Jung, and it just hasn't gone that way. My own first therapist, who I worked with here in Boston, was a Gestalt therapist, heavily influenced by Rank and by Wilhelm Reich, more really than by Fritz Perls. And then when I moved to New York, I went to see his teacher, who was one of the older teachers of Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy is almost sort of faded out now, but it was very alive in the 70s and 80s. And so I never had a Jungian analyst. I never had Jungian teachers. I did my training, in these psychiatric universities at Harvard and then at New York Hospital. And the teachers were, in those days in the psychiatry department, the good teachers that I were drawn to were all Freudian psychoanalysts, of various persuasions. I think there were no Jungians. And at every juncture of my training and my life, I thought I would move to San Francisco, where I belonged, and where there would be more Jungians. But it just didn't happen. So rather than try to do a superficial, pull in something that I didn't really know from inside, I've left it for other people to do that. No. He's asking, do I know a name that I don't know in New York, a Jungian? There was one very elderly Jungian teacher in New York that some people who came to see me had seen before they seen me, and they talked very highly of that person. I can't remember his name, but I never met him. Yeah. The first part of the question is, do I work with patients now? Mostly what I do is work with patients. Yeah, I see a lot of patients, day in, day out. Can the average guy who suffers from anxiety get anything from my book? Is that what you're asking? Books themselves as vehicles of relieving anxiety, I'm not so sure the book is necessarily the answer. I think the books, I think of my books as like self-improvement books for people who don't read self-improvement books, I think the books can point you in a direction. They can motivate you maybe to get help if there's an underlying anxiety, if something's going on that you or anyone else has, that you're keeping private. I think what the book can do is say, hey, everyone, or not everyone, but a lot of people are dealing with a lot of stuff, and here are various things that have helped. Meditation has helped me enormously in various ways. Psychotherapy has helped me enormously in various ways. I really believe in the value of therapy. So the book might foster something. I don't think by itself it's going to do much. Yeah, well, the book is, at its best, what I'm trying to do in the book is talk about where my understanding has come to and how it's changed. And so some people might find that they can relate to that. So that's useful. The question is about the real world. She's saying that she's been a sympathizer to Buddhism over the years, but has had one of the problems that she's had with it has to do with the way it sometimes seems to locate the problems that are in the real world, in the external world, in the mind. And so could I comment on its applicability or non-applicability for problems in the real world, even up to what's happening in Gaza at the moment? The main thing that I've gotten from Buddhism and even psychotherapy about this issue is that it's very helpful to do what one can to fix oneself at the same time as you're trying to fix what's in the world. So I think it's a misreading to say, oh, the problems out there are just reflections of what's happening in my mind, so if I fix my mind, I'm fixing Gaza. That doesn't make any sense. It takes real people with incredible dedication, giving of themselves completely, trying to make reconciliation, or, you can talk about it in a million different ways, but people are more effective when their minds are clearer, when they're clearer in themselves. So it's very helpful when one of my Buddhist teachers teaches a retreat every year just for activists, just so that they can have like 10 days in New Mexico, working on themselves because they've been, so other-directed, for so long that they're in danger of disintegrating, So I think I see it more, the same with the retreats. I'm not into living my life in retreat, I'm into living my life in my life, raising a family and seeing patients and so on. But to be able to go in and out of the retreat over time, allows for, some kind of ongoing hope and energy. She's asking, for a Buddhist doing therapy, how is that therapy different from a non-Buddhist doing therapy? For instance, is there less looking back at the past, more trying to be in the present kind of thing? I don't really know, because as someone heavily influenced by Buddhism doing therapy, I'm just making it up as I go along. So it's hard for me to know what I would be like as a therapist without the Buddhist thing, in my mind. For a long time, I kind of prided myself on not asking about the past. Because, coming from that same place that your question's coming from, if I can stay really in the present, then what needs to come out ought to come out. And I think that's basically true, but I remember telling my own therapist and supervisor that, kind of boasting to him about how I didn't have to. I felt like it was cheating, I remember saying. I felt like it's cheating if I ask about the past, and he sort of looked at me with disdain and said, who are you cheating? So that was good. I'm not sure. I think a good therapist is a good therapist, period. And someone influenced by Buddhism versus someone who's agnostic versus a Christian therapist. What you don't want to do is to be laying your religious or spiritual or philosophical beliefs on anybody. What you want to be doing is making room in the room for whatever's going on with the person so that you can relate to it clearly and honestly and, trying to be helpful without trying too hard to be helpful. And I think Buddhism's been helpful to me in teaching me how to find that place. There's a place I go to when I'm being the therapist, where I'm actually more comfortable there than in the rest of my life. But that's my limitation. The question began with him saying that he's dabbled in Buddhism, though he doesn't call himself a Buddhist. But before we started, he was reading the beginning of my book to try to get a sense of where I was coming from. And he saw that what I was talking about there was, in my initial attraction to Buddhism, I had some difficulty with the idea of no self, the Buddhist notion of no self, which is a central idea in Buddhism, that the self that we take to be so real actually does not exist at all. That in my own experience, as I write about in the beginning of the book, the more I investigated this idea of no self and the more experience I had in meditation, the more actually expansive my own sense of myself became. And that was curious to me, interesting to me, and I think not unique to me. And he was saying for himself also, he's had that, a sense of that. He said, if there's no self, what's the point in trying to improve a self that doesn't exist? And he wanted to know what is Buddha nature, and what might doing therapy from the place of Buddha nature look like? Am I doing justice to your question? Well, the whole idea of no self is central to the investigation that one undertakes when one meditates or studies Buddhism, when one meditates from a Buddhist perspective, because it's essential to the psychology. But everyone misunderstands what no self means. If it were easy to understand, you wouldn't have to spend your life pursuing it, So you can basically assume, like when the great teacher in Tibet named Tsongkhapa, he lived in the 16th century. He founded the Gelugpa school that the Dalai Lama is now the head of. When he had his enlightenment experience, the first thing he said was, it's exactly the opposite of what I thought. So if his enlightenment was, if his understanding of no self was exactly the opposite of what he thought, then just think about what you think it might be, and try to imagine what the opposite would be. Thurman, my friend Robert Thurman, who I've mentioned before, says that his teacher, who he had a Mongolian teacher in New Jersey who had emigrated from Tibet early, and Thurman in 1960 became a Buddhist monk and studied with him. That's how he learned the language and so on. He says that his teacher used to say to him, it's not that you're not real. It's not that you don't have a self. Of course you have a self. Of course you're real. But the problem with you is you think you're really real. So it's that, there's that extra sense of really real that the Buddhists see, that we impute, you know, this extra sense of solidity, this extra sense of, oh yeah, there's really a little me in here, you know, the homunculus of me that I'm protecting, you know, that most of us who are not enlightened are carrying that sense, you know, and then even if we think we understand no self, then really that's our ego, you know, that's proud that we have an understanding of no self, so we're still kind of cloaked in that. But I think it is possible, even if you're not enlightened, to have some intuitive sense of what Buddha nature might be, you know, like what it might be like to not be so identified with the person you know yourself to be, and that there's a little room around the edges of that identification that you can sometimes tap into. And I think therapy can be a forum, can be a place where that gets communicated, you know, around the edges of whatever is being talked about. When the identification with pain, when the identification with one's own trauma loosens a little bit, I think there can be a hint of Buddha nature there.